Harvard legend Alan Dershowitz sneered across the MSNBC set. "You're too young to understand the Constitution." But when Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett calmly pulled out his own writings and used them to expose his hypocrisy on live TV, America froze. Was this the moment the courtroom gatekeepers lost their grip on truth? What happened next stunned the nation. Before we get to this explosive moment, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe truth still matters, hit subscribe. We've got another jaw-dropping story coming tomorrow. The MSNBC studio lights were sharp, almost theatrical, casting a sterile glow across the glass desk where two ideological titans sat frozen in their chairs. On one end, Professor Alan Dershowitz, towering in reputation and trimmed in a tailored Navy suit, leaned forward slightly, his lips curled in a trade Travery, Harvard smirk. On the other, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat still in her burgundy blazer, composed, unreadable. Her shoulders didn't twitch, her fingers didn't move, only her eyes flickered with an unmistakable current of heat. The segment was supposed to be a civil discussion on voting rights and the Constitution, but as the countdown clock hit 0 and the red light above the camera blinked on, civility evaporated. Alan Dershowitz didn't ease in with a scholarly tone. He went in for the kill. "Congresswoman," he began, "I've studied the Constitution since before you were born. Perhaps you should take notes." A gasp swept through the studio like a cold wind. Andrea Mitchell visibly winced. The sound technician dropped a pen. Even the intern holding the cue cards blinked in disbelief. This wasn't just condescension. It was a public slap veiled in academic elitism. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She didn't smile. Instead, she reached calmly for the slim tablet beside her water glass, tapped it once, and flipped it open like a surgeon exposing a rib cage. Without raising her voice, without betraying the emotional landmine just tossed at her feet, she spoke. "I actually did take notes, Professor," she said. "In fact, I've got a few of yours right here." Then she began to read, verbatim, from Alan Dershowitz's own book, The Case for Constitutional Balance, published in 1992. Paragraph by paragraph, she cited his words about judicial overreach, congressional oversight, and the danger of absolutist interpretations, lines he had written in a very different political climate, with a very different ideological target. The silence in the studio became heavy. Dershowitz blinked, once, twice. Crockett kept going. She pulled up another quote. This time, from a 2003 Harvard Law Journal article, where Dershowitz warned against the erosion of constitutional protections under the guise of executive necessity. Her finger hovered above each citation like a scalpel pressing against soft flesh. Andrea Mitchell didn't speak. The audience didn't move. It was no longer a panel. It was a courtroom, and Crockett had just stepped into the role of both prosecutor and precedent. Then, as if punctuating a gavel's fall, the screen cut to black. This wasn't just a debate. It was a legal reckoning. Alan Dershowitz wasn't just a legal scholar. He was a legend. A tenured professor at Harvard Law by the age of 28. He defended the likes of O.J. Simpson, Klaus von Bülow, and Julian Assange. He was name-dropped in law school textbooks, interviewed on every major network, and quoted by presidents. When he walked into a courtroom, clerks straightened their backs. When he entered a studio, producers hushed the room. He had the kind of intellectual gravitas that made the Constitution feel like it flowed through his veins. For decades, Dershowitz was the embodiment of elite legal brilliance, sharp, verbose, impossible to rattle. He had always spoken from above the fray, from ivory towers built of citations, courtrooms, and CNN specials. But lately, the tower had started to crack. After decades of center-left credentials, Dershowitz stunned the legal world by defending Donald Trump during his first impeachment trial. The move set off a domino effect. Appearances with Tucker Carlson, a defense of Trump's perfect call, and increasingly erratic statements about cancel culture eroded his credibility with the very audience that once revered him. And then came the Epstein cloud. Though Dershowitz denied wrongdoing, his association with Jeffrey Epstein became a permanent shadow, one that no legal footnote could dismiss. Suddenly, his name didn't draw deference, it drew scrutiny. Younger lawyers rolled their eyes at his op-eds. Legal podcasts dissected his contradictions. Law students stopped citing him. In elite circles, whispers grew louder. Dershowitz is brilliant, but he's no longer relevant. The old guard still invited him to fundraisers and alumni events, but the rooms felt colder now, more polite than admiring. It wasn't just about politics. It was about the sense that Dershowitz no longer understood the world he once shaped. He spoke about law like it existed in a vacuum, untouched by race, gender, technology, or lived experience. That kind of thinking, in a post-2020 world, felt more than outdated. It felt dangerous. So when MSNBC offered a televised debate with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a civil rights attorney turned viral political force, Dershowitz didn't hesitate. He saw it not as a risk, but a stage, a chance to redeem himself, a chance to outwit the TikTok generation with pure, old-school legal firepower. "She's a child in a lawyer's suit," he was overheard telling a producer, chuckling with condescension. "Let's hope she brought a notepad." What he didn't bring was humility. Or preparation. Jasmine Crockett never cared for titles. She didn't enter politics to become the honorable. She entered because she had seen what happened when laws were written by people who had never spent a single day defending the powerless. From her earliest days as a public defender in Texas, she understood that the courtroom wasn't just a place for theory. It was where lives got broken or rebuilt. She carried that fire into civil rights law, then into the halls of Congress, becoming one of the rare few who brought a trial lawyer's mind to political combat. Her rise wasn't powered by elite credentials or media polish. It was built in the trenches, standing beside clients railroaded by bad charges, families evicted by loopholes, voters silenced by red tape. When she spoke on the House floor, she didn't quote theory. She quoted case law. When she appeared on MSNBC, she didn't perform. She prosecuted. Crockett was the legal version of a scalpel, precise, sharp, and devastating when wielded correctly. But what made her dangerous wasn't just her logic. It was her ability to read culture, power, and intention, all in real time. Dershowitz saw her as another rising progressive voice. What he failed to see was her preparation. While he dismissed her as a child in a lawyer's suit, her team had quietly assembled a digital binder of his contradictions. 3 decades of televised interviews, op-eds, court transcripts, law review articles, even social media posts. Every time Dershowitz had shifted his stance, on executive power, on judicial review, on civil liberties, was cataloged and time-stamped. Crockett didn't just come to the table with her own arguments. She came prepared to use his words against him. "This isn't a courtroom," her aide warned. "This is a trap." Crockett nodded. "He's betting on arrogance. I'm betting on receipts." She had debated Marjorie Taylor Greene in Congress, gone viral dismantling Tucker Carlson's replacement theory nonsense, and fought Texas Republicans over voter ID laws. But this was something deeper. This wasn't just generational. It wasn't just political. This was institutional. It was the old guard underestimating lived experience. It was academia sneering at courtroom battle scars. In a podcast recorded weeks before the debate, she said, "I didn't study law to write about it. I studied law to use it." The line would become prophetic. She didn't walk into that studio to raise her voice. She walked in to raise the floor and make sure the entire country could see who had been standing on it all along. Alan Dershowitz didn't waste time. The moment Andrea Mitchell handed him the floor, he leaned forward, voice steeped in Harvard authority. "Let me begin by reminding everyone that young progressives often confuse civil rights with legal rights. One is moral, the other is constitutional. They are not interchangeable." His tone wasn't argumentative, it was declarative. A lecture delivered with the assurance of decades in ivy-covered classrooms and televised trials. Cameras zoomed in. Audience members stiffened. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless, her expression unreadable. Dershowitz continued, citing Brown v. Board, Roe v. Wade, and Shelby County v. Holder, like a preacher quoting scripture. "The Constitution, Congresswoman, is not a passion project. It is a discipline. And frankly, this generation's obsession with outrage over order will be its downfall." He gestured toward Crockett, but still she didn't interrupt. Andrea Mitchell briefly looked toward her, half expecting a rebuttal, but Crockett's silence held. She wasn't here to spar. She was here to finish something. "And I say this with all due respect," Dershowitz said, the smile on his face sharpening to something just short of smug. "But you're too young to understand constitutional nuance. Legal theory requires detachment, not slogans." The audience let out a collective breath, like someone had just turned the temperature up. You could hear the scratch of pens stop. Crockett blinked once. That was it. Dershowitz wasn't done. He opened a folder beside him and pulled out a few highlighted pages. "In fact, your own commentary on the Voting Rights Act misses key distinctions. You've cited Article 1, Section 4, yet ignored the critical restraints in the 10th Amendment. That's not oversight. That's intellectual dishonesty masquerading as advocacy." Andrea Mitchell squirmed. "Professor," she tried to interject. But Dershowitz kept going, barely acknowledging her. "This isn't personal. It's legal hygiene. If we allow feelings to dictate the Constitution, we no longer have a republic. We have a performance." There it was, the word. Performance. Directed squarely at her. And still, Crockett didn't flinch. She reached down, adjusted the hem of her sleeve, and placed her hands together on the table. Her eyes were fixed on him now, not wide with shock, but narrow with intention. Dershowitz misread it as intimidation. He straightened his shoulders. "You're here to learn, Congresswoman," he concluded, "so consider this a masterclass." The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was loaded. It was tense. It was the sound of a country holding its breath, waiting to see if a Harvard legend had just buried himself with the last sentence he'd ever say without interruption. Jasmine Crockett didn't look at Andrea Mitchell. She didn't look at the camera. She looked straight at Alan Dershowitz. And then, softly, calmly, she began. "Professor Dershowitz," she said, her voice even but firm, "you mentioned this was a master class. Let's treat it like one." She reached forward, tapped her tablet, and turned it slightly toward the camera. "Let's begin. With Davidson v. Miller, 1998. A flicker of confusion passed across Dershowitz's face. "You argued that case," Crockett continued. "And in your oral argument to the Court of Appeals, you insisted on a broad interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause. You said, and I quote, 'Constitutional rights must evolve with the needs of an expanding democracy, not contract under the weight of outdated fears.'" She paused, letting the quote hang in the air. The room felt suddenly smaller. "That was your position then," she said, eyes locked on him. "And yet here, today, you told America that civil rights and legal rights are separate, fixed. That outrage has no place in interpretation. That Evoe showed as a threat." She tilted her head slightly. "So which Alan Dershowitz are we listening to?" The MSBC production room was silent. No rustling papers, no coughing. Even Andrea Mitchell sat frozen, lips slightly parted. Crockett's words weren't loud, but they were undeniable. They were precise, legal, and laced with a confidence that didn't shout because it didn't need to. Dershowitz opened his mouth, but she raised a hand, still respectfully, and continued. "Let's keep going. In a 1993 Harvard Law Review article, you wrote, and again I quote, 'Originalism is the opiate of those afraid to admit society has changed.' The Constitution was meant to breathe." She tapped again. The quote lit up behind them on the screen, MSNBC graphics already catching up to the moment. "Article," Crockett added, "has been cited in over 24 law school casebooks. But tonight, you've rejected the very philosophy that built your academic legacy." A stunned gasp slipped from the audience. Someone whispered, "She's quoting his own scholarship to dismantle him." Crockett pressed forward. "This isn't about age, Professor. It's about consistency. You can't rewrite your legacy just because it no longer fits the politics of the moment. Legal theory isn't your private chessboard." Dershowitz blinked rapidly. His smile was gone. replaced with a thin line of lips pressed shut. Crockett's tone hadn't wavered once. "Masterclass," she echoed one last time. "You taught it. I just remembered the syllabus." Andrew Mitchell didn't move. She didn't have to. The silence had said everything. A Harvard legend had just been confronted with the most devastating citation of all. His own words. And for the first time in his long career, Alan Dershowitz had nothing left to quote. Alan Dershowitz shifted in his seat. For a man who had once stood before the Supreme Court with nothing but confidence and a yellow legal pad, the pressure tonight was unfamiliar. The lights weren't hotter, the cameras weren't closer, but the truth was. He tried to recover. "Congresswoman, law evolves," he said, offering a thin smile. "Any good scholar knows that interpretations change with the times." Crockett nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right. But there's a difference between evolution and convenience. One grows from principle, the other bends with opportunity." The studio went still again. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. Controlled, articulate, unshaken. Her posture remained perfect, her voice steady, but it was the documentation, the inarguable facts, that made it lethal. "Let's talk about executive privilege," she continued, pulling up another file. "In 2006, you warned that unchecked executive privilege would threaten the democratic fabric. But in 2020, you defended a president's right to absolute executive immunity. Same legal mind. Two completely opposite stances." She gave him a few seconds, let it land. "Is that evolution?" she asked. "Or is that alignment with power?" Dershowitz opened his mouth, but the words weren't forming. The pause became a moment. The moment became a memory. One viewers would recall again and again. Crockett didn't stop. "Your 1999 memo to the Clinton legal team on judicial recusal? You wrote that no justice can fairly rule on matters where personal bias is reasonably perceived. But you've since defended judges with known political entanglements. Why the change?" The control room could be heard muttering in the background. One producer whispered into his headset, "We're watching a generational shift happen live." Andrea Mitchell turned ever so slightly toward Dershowitz, as if silently urging him to respond, to save himself. He raised a hand to gesture, but no words followed. Crockett had done something far rarer than out-argue him. She had removed his ability to posture. And then came the final cut. "You don't have constitutional principles, Professor," Crockett said quietly. "You have constitutional positions. For hire." It wasn't a yell. It wasn't even bitter. It was a factual summary of the collapse playing out on live television. The gasp from the audience wasn't orchestrated. It was real. Mitchell reached for her earpiece. "We need a break," she muttered. Dershowitz sat back, blinking, lips pressed tight as if holding back everything he no longer had the grounding to say. Crockett adjusted her tablet and waited. Calm, ready, unmoved. The legacy was cracking, and America was watching every fracture form in real time. The moment the segment aired, the internet ignited like a dry prairie under lightning. A single clip, Jasmine Crockett, seated calmly in her burgundy blazer, quoting Alan Dershowitz's own words back at him, spread across platforms in a digital firestorm. Within the first 2 hours, it had amassed over 2 million views. By hour 6, it cracked 10 million. But the numbers only told half the story. This wasn't just viral, it was cultural ignition. The hashtags began to stack like courtroom exhibits. Crockett crushes Dershowitz. I law not legally, propelled by a Gen Z law students reacting the moment in dorm rooms and lecture halls. Some wearing robes and pretending to object, while others played Crockett in slow, deliberate tone. I believe these are your words, Professor. The timing was crisp, the editing cinematic. Even late-night comedy shows clipped in. Jimmy Fallon joked, I haven't seen a Harvard professor this quiet since finals week. Twitter lawyers dubbed her Justice Crockett, not sarcastically, but aspirationally. What stunned America wasn't just the takedown, it was how quietly it happened. No yelling, no slamming fists, just documentation, precision, and a near-clinical composure. A viral quote emerged from Crockett's response, now printed on t-shirts and bumper stickers. "Calm isn't weakness, it's strength with a spine." That line became a movement overnight, adopted by black professionals, women in law, and every public servant who'd ever been talked down to by someone clinging to credentials instead of truth. Veterans groups surprisingly joined the chorus. One former JAG officer posted on X, "We fought so voices like hers could be heard in rooms like that. This was a battle won without a raised fist." His comment was shared by the U.S. Army's own diversity office. Crockett's calm power resonated beyond the courtroom. It became a national metaphor. Then came the memes. Dershowitz's stunned face, eyebrows lifted, lips pressed together, was paired with Crockett's narrowed eyes and subtle smirk. Captions like, "When receipts read louder than voices," and "Bar exam passed, ego failed," flooded Reddit and Instagram. A side-by-side image went particularly viral. On one half, Crockett holding her tablet. On the other, Dershowitz flipping through his notes, visibly rattled. The caption read, "One read the Constitution." The other just quoted himself. CN ran a chyron that night. Harvard legend silenced by Texas justice. Anderson Cooper called it the cleanest takedown I've seen in a live debate. Oprah, never one to overpost, retweeted the clip and wrote simply, "This is what knowing your receipts looks like." The post had over 800,000 likes by morning. High school and college debate teams adopted the exchange into their curriculum. Some teachers replaced older footage of congressional hearings with Crockett's segment. A Seattle civics teacher said, "It's not just about what was said, it's how she said it. With grace, with research, and with the power of the Constitution behind her." Even those outside the legal world understood they had witnessed a rare moment of televised accountability, where expertise wasn't assumed, but earned in real time. The moment also reopened conversations about generational power and institutional arrogance. MSNBC's YouTube comments became a war room of praise, questions, and tears. One user wrote, "I'm a black woman who left law school in the 90s because I was told I was too emotional for this profession. Watching Jasmine Crockett today felt like justice arriving late, but arriving." The shock wasn't just that Crockett stood her ground. It was that she did so without ever raising her voice, proving that dignity could dismantle elitism and preparation could break down prestige. It was a reminder that the law isn't just in the hands of the old. It lives in the clarity of those bold enough to confront it. By sunrise, the headlines had taken on a rhythm. The New York Times led with, "Crockett School's a legal giant." NPI followed with, "Civil rights lawyer makes legal history on live television." The Washington Post, not usually prone to hyperbole, simply declared, "A shift in the American legal voice." And every cable news debate, even CNN, aired the clip on repeat, framing it not as a simple debate, but a landmarked cultural shift. Inside MSNBC, producers knew they had captured lightning in a bottle. Their YouTube upload of the Crockett-Dershowitz segment became the network's most zenith action piece of content that month, overtaking even exclusive election coverage and international crisis interviews. They created a dedicated replay slot for it during primetime. Rachel Maddow opened her show with the segment, "This," she said, pausing for effect, "is how power meets preparation." As the media frenzy expanded, Dershowitz quickly initiated damage control. He appeared on Fox News the following evening, claiming he was ambushed by a hyper-prepared opposition team who cherry-picked his decades of writing. But the framing backfired. The internet remembered what Crockett had said. "These are your words, Professor. I just added the timestamp." No one was buying his attempt to reframe the moment. It wasn't an ambush. It was accountability, televised. Harvard law students took to social media with a hashtag of their own, "She taught us." A now viral thread read, "He taught our professors." But tonight, she taught us. Screenshots of Crockett's poise, her tablet in hand, her direct gaze. These were shared like digital artifacts, something sacred. The moment wasn't just a clapback. It was a recalibration of who gets to be the expert, who gets to set the tone. Media outlets scrambled to book Crockett. but she declined most. Let the moment speak for itself, she told a staffer. Instead, she accepted one long-formed interview with PBS. The hour-long sit-down, filmed in black and white, featured Crockett talking about law as service, not spectacle. I didn't need to be louder, she said, because the Constitution already gave me volume. Legal journals began publishing in real time. The Yale Law Review opened its next issue with a rare editorial, "When Legal Consistency Meets Cultural Authority." Harvard Law Review published a piece titled "Originalism, Opportunism, and the Reckoning of Alan Dershowitz." Dozens of professors rewrote syllabi to include the Crockett exchange as a modern example of argumentation, ethical contradiction, and legal performance. For many law schools, it became required viewing. Even international outlets picked it up. BBC's Hard Talk ran a segment called "The American Lawyer Who Turned the Tables," airing Crockett's clip across Europe. Al Jazeera discussed the confrontation in the context of global judicial elitism and generational pushback. In Nigeria, where law students follow American legal tradition closely, the moment sparked classroom debates. One Nigerian student posted, "We study the Constitution, but now we study her." Meanwhile, Dershowitz faced growing skepticism from his own peers. Several bar associations quietly distanced themselves. 2 major law conferences canceled his keynote invitations, citing program reevaluation. Bookstores reduced his upcoming memoir's promotional shelf space, replacing it with new titles on modern advocacy, including one co-authored by Crockett's chief of staff titled "Receipts and Rule Books: The New Legal Vanguard." The contrast couldn't have been starker. Dershowitz, once the untouchable figure, the lion of liberal academia, now found himself on the defensive across every media platform. And Crockett? She wasn't just rising. She was defining the new center of gravity for legal and cultural authority. The shift had been televised, analyzed, and now institutionalized, not by shouting, not by scandal, but by a single moment of calm, surgical accountability. And the media, for once, didn't distort it. They documented it. In the days following the televised confrontation, the ripple effects inside the legal profession became impossible to ignore. What had started as a cable news moment was now a curricular priority. Law professors across the country began revising their Crockett-Dershowitz exchange as required viewing, but to restructure entire lessons around it. At Columbia Law, Professor Teresa McMillan told her students, "We're no longer just analyzing case law. We're examining legal ethos in the digital age." And Congresswoman Crockett just rewrote the standard. At Yale, the debate replaced a decades-old classroom example on judicial inconsistency. Stanford added a new seminar titled "The Law in Public Debate," with Crockett's performance anchoring the first 2 weeks. Students weren't just intrigued, they were energized. At Howard University, a third-year student tweeted, "Forget theory, this is how real law walks, talks, and cross-examines." Two associations began issuing quiet but clear statements. The American Bar Association released a memo emphasizing the importance of intellectual consistency in public legal advocacy, a diplomatic but pointed response that mirrored Crockett's central critique. Meanwhile, legal ethics boards started informally reviewing Dershowitz's public record. A panel in New York, according to one insider, began tracking a pattern of argumentative manipulation across decades. Another ethics committee in California began reevaluating a speaker invitation he had accepted 6 months prior. Dershowitz, once a fixture on legal symposiums and keynote stages, saw the cancellations stack quickly. A tech law conference in Silicon Valley dropped him without notice. A panel on civil liberties in Chicago replaced him with a rising voice from the ACLU. When contacted, organizers gave a short statement. "We're focused on voices that build bridges, not monuments to themselves." Sales of Dershowitz's upcoming book, a legal memoir titled "Presumed Correct," plummeted. Pre-orders stalled. Some bookstores removed promotional signage entirely. One independent retailer in D.C. displayed his book with a sticky note attached. "Ask us for a better read. Crockett's speech," instead. On the other hand, the public began demanding more from Crockett. A publisher reached out to her team with a 7-figure offer for a book deal. The title proposed by her communications director? Footnotes from the front lines. Inside Harvard Law, where Dershowitz had once reigned supreme, students demanded a public roundtable on generational legal ethics. They wanted to know how one of their own icons could drift so far from the principles he once championed. A student committee proposed a new tradition called the Crockett Clause, a symbolic event where legal contradictions would be publicly debated with documentation in hand. Even more notably, Crockett was invited to keynote Yale Law's spring conference, becoming the first sitting member of Congress to do so in over 20 years. The buzz wasn't about her politics, it was about her method. She didn't attack the man, one dean said. She challenged the framework. That distinction, that level of clarity, became the new gold standard in legal education. The confrontation wasn't framed as drama. It was archived as pedagogy. Legal journals weighed in with rare urgency. The University of Chicago Law Review published an op-ed titled "The End of Arrogance in American Law." It didn't just praise Crockett. It analyzed the structural weaknesses exposed in Dershowitz's legacy. A follow-up piece in the Texas Law Review focused on the rhetorical power of lived experience in legal argument, citing Crockett's background as the operational contrast to academic posturing. Legal blogs, often the front line of generational opinion, were ablaze. One viral essay read, "She didn't debate the professor, she performed an audit." A comment beneath it simply read, "Welcome to the era of verified advocacy." And in that moment, inside the walls of the profession, a shift occurred, not away from scholarship, but toward accountability. The gavel didn't fall. The echo did. Within 24 hours, the debate had transformed into something far larger than a cable news clip. It became a cultural landmark. T-shirts hit Etsy and TikTok storefronts overnight, boldly stamped with Crockett's closing line, "Your honorifics don't outweigh your hypocrisy." Another bestseller simply read, "You cite me, I cite you," stylized like a Supreme Court footnote. Gen Z made it fashion. Millennials turned it into home decor. One mug on Amazon, featuring Crockett's steely stare and the quote, "Receipts, not respect," sold out within hours. The moment had transcended television. It had entered the American lexicon of defiance. Law schools across the country integrated the debate into syllabi. Harvard Law, Columbia, Howard, and even smaller liberal arts colleges found a place for it in ethics modules and constitutional law discussions. It wasn't just a clash between two minds. It was a generational reckoning between power and purpose. Students began quoting Crockett in mock trials. One aspiring public defender from NYU tweeted, "I didn't know I wanted to do law until I saw her do that." Her delivery had the clarity of precedent and the sting of lived experience. The clip became required viewing in classes where students used to only read legal theory. Educators weren't the only ones moved. Activists and commentators weighed in, framing the moment as a cultural pivot. Black women's leadership networks reposted the clip with captions like, "This is what happens when brilliance meets restraint." The National Council of Black Women published a statement calling Crockett's performance proof that steel wrapped in silk works. They didn't need to shout her down. She didn't interrupt, she didn't grandstand, she simply revealed. And in a world conditioned to reward noise, her calm carried thunder. Her silence had been strategy, her citations scalpel sharp. Oprah Winfrey shared the clip on her Instagram account, with the caption, "This is how you take on the institution without losing your grace." The post received over 2.5 million likes within the first day. LeBron James reposted it to his story, writing, "Ooh, that's what leadership looks like." Social commentators dubbed the moment the Juncture viral moment. Devoid of rage, drenched in intellect, and sealed with precision. It wasn't a roast. It was a lesson. And in homes, classrooms, and community centers across the country, the lesson played on loop. Within the Democratic Party, whispers turned into waves. DNC Chair Jaime Harrison tweeted, "This is why representation matters. That wasn't just a debate. That was constitutional leadership on display." Party strategists flooded Crockett's inbox. Offers to headline fundraising dinners. Invitations to speak at state conventions. Some on the Hill even floated a future Supreme Court nomination. Not in jest, but in hushed tones meant for serious ears. "He's not just sharp," one senator confided to Politico. "She's got the kind of steel spine and courtroom instincts that would terrify the Federalist Society." Her campaign war chest reflected the shift. Within 72 hours of the MMBC debate airing, Crockett's Act Blue page shattered its own record. Nearly $2 million, 0 cents poured in from small dollar donations alone. One contributor left a note, "This is for the receipts, Congresswoman. Keep reading them out loud." Another simply wrote, "Silence them all." Her team scrambled to manage the influx, turning viral momentum into strategic outreach, swing state donors. Previously indifferent, now leaned in. A new voter base had been ignited. Educated, justice-driven independents who saw in Crockett not just a fighter, but a constitutional mind with poise. On the Republican side, the attacks came swiftly and fell flat. Conservative pundits on Fox and Newsmax tried labeling her a disrespectful upstart, but their talking points crumbled under the reality that Crockett never raised her voice, never interrupted, never wavered. She simply cited the Constitution and Dershowitz's own contradictions. Even center-right outlets like The Hill and The Bulwark published pieces titled, "Why the Right Shouldn't Underestimate Jasmine Crockett." One former GOP strategist wrote, "She didn't yell. She revealed. That's what made it devastating." Polling told the rest of the story. An MSNBC snap poll of registered independents showed 62% demonstrated exceptional command of the Constitution. Among Democratic voters under 40, that number jumped to 81%. Meanwhile, Dershowitz's approval, even within legal circles, plunged. His defenders were conspicuously quiet. The Harvard Law Review issued no defense. Former students declined to speak. One commentator on X, formerly Twitter, summed it up with brutal clarity. He tried to school her. She ended his class. By week's end, a Washington Post op-ed asked the question aloud. Is Jasmine Crockett the future of American law? The headline wasn't clickbait. It reflected a deeper shift. This wasn't about winning a debate. It was about rewriting who America saw as qualified to shape its legal destiny. Crockett hadn't just defended herself. She had defended an entire generation's right to be heard with calm, brilliance, and an unflinching belief in truth over tenure. What America witnessed that night wasn't just a legal debate. It was a generational reckoning. In one corner stood Alan Dershowitz, a symbol of institutional legacy, whose decades of experience had once shaped national legal discourse. In the other, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, not just a voice for her district, but a force now etched into the fabric of American political and legal history. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt. She brought receipts, precision, and poise, and in doing so, she redefined what legal power looks like in the 21st century. This wasn't about left versus right. This was about principle versus performance, the rule of law versus the cult of prestige. Crockett reminded America that brilliance isn't housed in ivy-covered buildings alone. It walked into courtrooms from neighborhoods that have known injustice. It speaks with lived experience, not just academic footnotes. And when challenged, it does not retreat. It rises. Now, the real question is, where do we go from here? If you believe in calm, unshakable truth, if you believe that legal institutions should evolve with moral clarity, if you believe that the next generation of leaders should carry both the Constitution and courage, then don't just watch. Take action. Subscribe to Agora Files for more stories that challenge power with truth. Share this video with 5 people who still believe in facts over fear. Drop a comment below. What moment from the debate hit you hardest? In an age of sound bites, Crockett gave us substance. In a system built on privilege, she showed the power of preparation. And in the face of legal arrogance, she held the line. Not for herself, but for everyone who ever doubted whether they belonged at the table. Let this be more than a viral clip. Let it be a turning point. Because America just watched the past get challenged and the future rise. Now it's your move.